If language is both a map of the world and its own world, readers are obsessive cartographers, moving always on the border of two spheres. Hey everybody, thank you as always for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I've got a very exciting episode of the Why Do We Read Fiction series. The only title I have for it comes from the most striking image and thought from the book from which we'll be taking our cue, which is Readers as Obsessive Cartographers. We're talking about cartographers of the mind. But what I more or less want to do is highlight books promiscuously read by Heather Cass White. And by the way, she gets her title from John Milton, of all people, whom I have just been immersed in, especially with Paradise Lost, a few videos back in the fall. And I actually was commissioned to write a review for this by Rain Taxi and got published in print in one of their issues. I'm really excited about that. And I talked about this book at the beginning of some video, and a student of Cass White's brought it to her attention and she emailed me. So that was just a really wonderful moment of knowing that it was brought to a teacher's attention that they've been heard and celebrated, because this is a wonderful book. And I'm literally just going to go through and give you sort of the highlights from me from the book. All reading has to offer is a particular, irreplaceable internal experience. But readers should keep faith that that experience is enough. I couldn't help but think about Harold Bloom's quote from his controversial Western canon, and he talks about how all that reading books can do is to make your interior life a little more interesting. And these can be controversial propositions, especially within academia, as we'll find, or as I have found, especially in reading Rita Felsky's book, The Uses of Literature, because unfortunately we find ourselves in a time where in academia, that's just not quite enough to keep the funding, to keep the departments there, to keep the classes there. Everything has to be bound up in a teleology that's greater than that, or something that's going to profit directly the economy. And being someone who makes money and puts food on the table in full-time IT, even though, I dream about living a life in books in some way, it is hard for me to connect with that and sympathize with that, because I tend to align myself more with the romantic idea of reading and enlarging the interior self being enough of a justification. She says, we go there because we have a self that must be articulated, and because we do not have a self until we find its articulation. And exactly, books offer a very unique way of understanding the self and giving us that final vocabulary, as we talked about from Mark Edmondson via Richard Rorty. Each reader finds a personal canon of such challenging and enlarging books and spends a lifetime, if he or she is lucky, revising it. I love that idea of all of us establishing a personal canon, but the key word is spending a lifetime revising it, challenging it. And this is where I get the title from the video. If language is both a map of the world and its own world, readers are obsessive cartographers, moving always on the border of two spheres. So again, I think that wraps up several of the episodes in this series. The big provocation and thesis in the title is that for Cass White, it's essential that our reading stays wild. It may be that the most important function of required reading is to stimulate our resistance to it in the form of reading that is haphazard, spontaneous, whimsical, contrarian. In a word, our reading is best when it is promiscuous. And she takes a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary: done or applied with no regard for method, order, etc. Random, indiscriminate, unsystematic. She says books themselves drift all over the place, and so should we in our encounters with them. She notes that for Don Quixote, I love this, for Don Quixote, there is no defeat in his life except a lapse in faithfulness to his books. Isn't that amazing? The more you think about it, the more you realize that, yes, the only defeat, and he suffers a very many defeats, but the only defeat for him would be any lapse in just being faithful to those chivalric romances that he has read. Oh, this is wonderful. If sentences cohere in a Newtonian universe of stable coordinates, they nevertheless originate in and draw the reader back into the quantum foam of phonetic play. The mind is active on both scales, large and small, at once. In reading, we absorb and parse ideas, themes, storyline, and structure, large-scale patterns that unite the many disparate reading sessions it takes us to experience the whole of a book, like Don Quixote. Simultaneously, however, we read on the moment-to-moment microscale of word, letter, and sound, particles winking in and out of existence according to the quality of our attention to them. Love that. Down at that quantum level, in the quantum foam of the reading experience, she says the sound of language is its own event, with an independent logic that guides the story. We read to enter a place that is unpoliced and private, to step away from boundaries as we usually experience them. She's talking about characters in Middlemarch here. Hide it though she does, Dorothea, behind a screen of admirably feminine motives, principally being of service to her scholar husband. Dorothea wants to taste forbidden fruit. She begs to learn Latin and Greek. Her alibi is that they will allow her to be more helpful to his great work. Reading as a way to indulge in transgression without transgressing in the world. Casaubon's descent into tyranny is a cautionary tale about reading badly. Dorothea's suffering and the expansion of her soul it facilitates are potential effects of reading well. Read this book if only for her thoughts on Middlemarch as an analogy for reading. She says all of us are born hungry, but some of us seem to be born without an enzyme necessary to our digestive system and find only in books the supplement we need to live. So if you've been watching through this series and you find yourself thinking, this is just a bunch of wacky ideas, these this type of reading is obviously out there, like ridiculous. Just read a book and enjoy it and move on, man. Then you probably have been born with that enzyme, whereas those of us who are such obsessive cartographers have not. And I love that Cass White, though an academic, is so intimately in touch with the pleasures and experiences of reading. She says, there are times when our reading is so good that it causes us to look up from the page. When our reading is so good that it makes us stop reading. We stop because we get near in those moments to something essential and unbearable. This is not a how-to book, as the title implies. It's a book that's attempting to make reading enjoyable and attractive and alluring, to rediscover the joys of reading that a lot of us leave way behind, especially if we get caught up in the largely academic mode of being distant from the work and thus objective and more critical. I love how Cass White encourages us to just sort of shred all of our lists, knock down all the TBR piles, forget about priorities, be promiscuous with your books. Make sure to take time to be haphazard and whimsical, playful If something appeals to you, go after it with everything. Be an obsessive cartographer. That is a map maker, someone who wants to constantly explore new territory and thus enlarge the map of the known world. And out of this will grow your personal canon of books. But even when you have that, it should constantly challenge. You should constantly still set out for new discoveries, challenging whether it needs to be revised or not. Another way of saying this is that becoming receptive and staying that way is the pathway to insight. Reading, pursued over a lifetime, is deep practice in reception. Alert, relaxed, keen, and unguarded, the reading self easily occupies an otherwise elusive and fleeting state of awareness in which no answer need be final. No one moment need be decisive. In that fluid medium, insight is free to gather and effloresce.